The Sine Institute of Policy and Politics is American University's incubator for policy innovation. We convene leaders in the academic, public, private, nonprofit, and journalism sectors to engage and promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. In an evolving world, we seize the opportunity to work on the nation's most pressing challenges through collaboration by experts and top scholars in their field with students in research and scholarship. As part of that goal, the Sine Institute leverages American University's location in our nation's capital, the nexus of government and a growing international business center. We connect diverse perspectives from around the country and around the world with our world-class academics and research, experienced practitioners, and the most politically active student body in the U.S. We stand apart through our focus on the role of business and the nonprofit community in public policy, the rise of the importance of economic regions in the United States, and international policy issues. Our focus is to make an immediate impact at the intersection of policy and politics that leads to real and lasting change. Thank you for joining us as we convene, communicate, and collaborate. Introducing Sine Institute 2022 Fellow, Michele Norris Johnson.
Good everyone. Hello to those who are in the room and to anyone who's online. If you're online, can you do us a favor? Can you just throw something in the chat room to let us know you're there? And that way I want to make sure as we begin our discussion that we are fully inclusive of everyone who's in the chat space. As you heard, the Sine Institute looks at the intersection of policy and politics. We're going to talk a little bit today about the intersections of policy, politics, and personal experience through the idea of something that I refer to as accidental archives. My name is Michele Norris. I'm a columnist with the Washington Post. I am the founding director of an accidental archive. It's called the Race Card Project. And just to give you a quick background, I think many of you have been with me before. I see a new face. There may be some new faces online. So just a quick run through, and we can do this pretty quick, of the Race Card Project and what it is. I'm a longtime storyteller, and I am, in the last decade, I have become a story collector. And that is through my work at the Race Card Project. I have been collecting personal stories about race and cultural identity from individuals all over the world. And as you'll see in, I think it would be probably the third slide there, you'll see a postcard, and that's how this project, my accidental archive, the Race Card Project, began, with people sending in postcards, because that's how we started. We actually asked people to send in their 6-word thoughts on postcards. And you'll see in this postcard why we still love postcards, even though most of the submissions come in digitally, because they're just, people turn them into works of art. We created a website, we created a digital form. We're now used in hundreds of schools across the country. The military, the State Department, the Justice Department has used the Race Card Project to stoke interesting conversations. And most of the cards come in digitally, but we still love those postcards. And you can see as we go through the slides how they started to populate. We'll go to the next slide there, every space in my home. And then as you see the slide there, you can see the sense of what people would do. I don't know who I am. That's Stacy Rosanna in Lake Elmo, Minnesota. And she took that card, you'll see it in the upper left-hand corner, and again, turned it into a work of art. Lower left-hand corner, I'm ashamed to be white. And sometimes people using the Race Card Project when they don't have the actual cards, but using whatever card they can find. Sometimes it's a recipe card, sometimes it's something they create. Being bilingual is not a sin. Let's build bridges, not create walls. And so what we've realized is the work that we're doing, and we can go to that next slide and you'll see, this is really what my third floor started to look like, because I had boxes and boxes and boxes of these cards, and now we have over 500,000 cards that we've officially archived. Most of them are digital, but we still have reams of these postcards. And we realized that we had this interesting archival space that helped us understand the world. I liken the work we do to dendrochronology being the study of trees. Trees will tell you something about the surrounding environment. This archive will tell you something about the sociological, economic, political environment in a period that's bookended by the presidencies of Barack Obama and Donald Trump, and then punctuated by the global pandemic, summer of protests, the killings of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, that daisy chain of death that we see on our small screens continues, all captured in the archives, as well as the appointment of the first Black woman Supreme Court justice. Just in your head, scroll through the things that have happened in just the last 4 weeks, let alone the last 12 years. So we're going to skip ahead, if you don't mind, to slide number 8. And just for those who aren't familiar, just to give you some quick numbers, the Race Car Project has been in operation now for 12 years. We're in our 12th year. We have archived more than 500,000 stories. We have cards, we have submissions that come from more than 50 states, and actually all 50 states and more than 100 countries. And that gives you just a sense of the scope. So what is an accidental archive? We can kind of, let's stay with slide number 9, if you don't mind, for now. What is an accidental archive? When you think about an archive or archives, what do you think of? Have you been to the National Archives? Have you been to that building? Fantastic. If you haven't been doing your time here, I recommend that you go, and probably go once a year, because they're fantastic at presenting different facets of American life. They will do nutrition one year, and then the next year they will do sport, and then they will do a year of childhood, a year of the woman, a year of what it means to be a gardener, and from subsistence gardens to gardening to people creating victory gardens during World War II to the garden culture that we see today. It is just a wonderful space of official archives. People who are PhDs, who have studied this, who know how to create an archive to capture a culture. An official archive. But we are surrounded all around us by unofficial archives, by things that capture the human experience, sometimes with intention and often in ways that people didn't think that they were creating an archive, but they sometimes do. So oral histories are an example of that. You can think of examples, I'm sure, in your life. But I'm going to tick through a few, and the first 2 I'm going to tick through, we all started our work sort of at the same time. So we kind of came out of the gate at the same time, and we all realized we had to keep going because of what we were collecting. So this is PostSecret. How many of you have heard of PostSecret? All right, I'm glad I could hip you to this and introduce you to PostSecret. Frank Warren used to live in suburban Washington, D.C. I actually interviewed him when he first started this project when I was still at National Public Radio. I was hosting a show called All Things Considered, read about him and thought, this is really interesting. He's onto something. He asked people to share secrets with him in just 6 words. I mean, not just 6 words. He just asked them to send secrets with him on postcards. And at first, they were coming to a mailbox outside his house. And then, like me, he had to take on a private mailbox, and you don't want people to know where you live. And then it also just got so large. But you can see, I mean, some of them are funny and kind of macabre and mean. I gave my vegetarian sister a meal with beef. And, but he, you know, and some of them make you laugh, but he also realized I've always wanted to rob a bank. But he also started to get really intense secrets, people talking about mental health issues, people talking about abuse, people talking about abortion, people talking about cutting themselves, thinking of hurting themselves. And so not only did he realize that he had an archive, he had a time bomb. He had something that he had to take care of very carefully, because in the way that I feel about my project, people sharing their truths with me, often very candid. In his case, because secrets are often so laden with emotion, he was picking up stories that that were tender and explosive. We're gonna go to the next slide. You may not have heard of PostSecret. And by the way, before we talk about the next, well, this is still Frank's work, and you can get a sense of the depth here. I never bothered to learn your names because I knew you wouldn't last. And in his case, we gave people postcards. He just said, send me postcards. And so in the way that people would turn the postcards, we gave them into works of art. In this case, they were working with a blank canvas, a blank canvas. I destroyed videos of myself as a child because it pains me to see a time before I ruined my innocence. Oh, wow. So he, like me, is figuring out, what do you do with this? Because he's doing his own version of dinner chronology. And this will help you understand an interesting moment in time. That's bookended, yes, in the same period, because we started around the same time. But what are the kinds of things that this archive might capture? Think about what's happened in the last 15 years. What's changed in terms of the way we keep secrets? He's collecting secrets at a time where we have given up our privacy. Isn't that interesting? So people are posting all kinds of things. They're living out loud through social media. We've basically given up our privacy. You go to the grocery store and you hear 18 conversations that you don't need to hear because people are on the phone, right? You pick up and you look at the Twitter or Instagram and you just don't want to know that much about people, right? But at the same time, people are still harboring things that they can't figure out where to share that. And they go to someone like Frank. I believe I will accomplish something truly great in this lifetime. I'm going to be 53 tomorrow. That is someone who is putting 10 toes down in the morning with hope. There's still time for me to make a difference in this world. And look at what she did to that card. Look at the colors of that card, the color temperature in that card. So you probably haven't heard of PostSecret, but I invite you to look at it. One thing I wanted to say is that Frank is using this work also in interesting ways. So he's written several books. He's collected these cards and he's written books about them. He also is doing a lot of important work with universities and schools. And they bring him in and they use his work, much like mine, in anthropological ways. So anthropologists often tell a tell a story to get a story. If I walk into a room and I just say, tell me something about yourself. If I'm lucky and if I'm good at what I do, I'm going to pull something out of you. But if I at first tell you a story, then I've rendered the conversation. And you're going to tell me a very different story, or a story that perhaps has more depth, more detail, more flavor to it, because I rendered the pot a little bit. And so that is what he does by bringing his cauldron of secrets into spaces. He makes it possible for universities to often do some very important work around the kinds of things that he's been able to excavate. Again, just by putting a basket on the table, proverbially, in his case saying, fill up my mailbox, and they did. So you might not have heard of PostSecret, but let's go to the next slide. And I bet you've heard of this, Humans of New York. Okay, so Brandon, around the same time, just started taking snaps of people in New York City and talking to them. And he realized that there's something about him. He's this big, tall dude. He kind of disappears and people talk. And if you follow him on Instagram, how many of you follow him on Instagram? Oh my goodness, the stories. I mean, I'm surprised that film companies or movie studios don't just follow him around looking for content, because the stories that he unearths are sometimes so much more interesting than what we are seeing in places like Netflix and Hulu. And once again, this is an accidental archive. And it captures interesting things. So the pictures that he was telling, he decided to do something around the anniversary of September 11th, because he realized in New York City he could capture a particular kind of story. His storytelling changed a little bit because now what are we all wearing? So suddenly you're out in the world capturing people's pictures and everyone's wearing masks. So his archive is interesting because you can look at a before and after notion of what it's like when people are wearing masks. What he found is that people, it's almost like the development of the human mind. If one pathway is cut off, another sense becomes very acute. For someone who can't hear, sometimes their sight is even stronger. You lose the sense of sight, your hearing becomes stronger, the sense of touch. When people started masking, they started revealing themselves in different ways. And that is an aspect of his archive. But another example of an accidental archive, we can go to the next slide there. And you get a sense of some of the people that he meets. And again, he's just doing this without, he just walks around with a very good camera, but without like the Richard Avedon treatment with gels and lights and all kinds of things. And he manages to capture people, not just because he's a good photographer, but because there's something in him that allows people to simply be themselves. So these pictures maybe look like they're posed, but they're generally candid pictures. And even when they're posing, he's capturing some aspect of their personality. So pictorial archives are also important. And I want to use the notion of a pictorial archive to talk about garage sales. So one of the things that I've discovered in doing research, that oftentimes archivists will spend their weekends going out and looking at garage sales and looking at estate sales and looking for snaps, looking for snapshots, for photos, for sort of the things that we capture in human life. And the example of that I always remember when I was writing a book about my family's complex racial legacy and my ties to the American South, with my father being from Birmingham, Alabama. The archivists in Birmingham did this wonderful project where they went to garage sales, rummage sales, junior league sales. Junior league is big in the South, and they often have these sales to raise money, and they just captured all kinds of photos. And then they took them back up at the library, and they did this over many years, and then they put them into categories. So all the pictures of people at Christmas, and all the pictures of people posing with a new car. Because there was a time in American life, and people maybe still do that. You get a new car, you pose next to it, but there was a time when a car was a really big deal. You got a car and you pose next to it in all of your best clothes and everything. First day of school pictures, various holidays, summer at the beach, down at the Gulf Shore, down near Mobile or someplace like that. And they put them into categories with total disregard of color. It's interesting because we're talking about Birmingham, Alabama, right? And so for many of for much of the period from which they were collecting these snaps, people did regard color, right? Birmingham is a place where color dictated where you could go and where you couldn't go. But they didn't do that with the pictures. They just did it by category. And what they discovered through that accidental archive is that people were living much the same life. Even during that period where the social strictures and the rules under Jim Crow segregation were so strict that you could not venture into parts of downtown. You could not use, my family, as an African American, could not use a dressing room, could not walk into the front door of most establishments to get a ham sandwich or a bucket of fried chicken. You had to go in the back door. If you went to the movie, you paid up front, you went outside, around back, up the stairs, and there was a fire escape, a little rickety stair that you would go up on the back of the building to enter a third balcony up near the top, and that's where you would watch the movies, and you'd be lucky if you could hear anything, because the speakers didn't even go up there. But what they realized during much of this period, where you had these very strict rules regarding who could go where, despite those rules, when they actually looked at the pictures, looked at how people decorated their homes at Christmas, looked at what the spread looked like at Thanksgiving, looked at how people celebrated those who came home from war, looked at those first car photos. They were wearing the same clothes, they were decorating their houses in the same way. Based on social strata, so if you were the sons of merchants, dressed perhaps differently than those who worked the fields, but within the social strata, their lives were not that different. And what an incredible lesson that is that you can find inside an accidental archive. Why don't we go to the next page there? So if we're thinking about current events, where might you find accidental archives today? I want to give you one example, the voices of the pandemic. This is from the University of Texas at Austin, and they decided to try to capture voices of the pandemic from a population whose stories were not well documented in the news cycle, in newspapers and public radio, in broadcast television. And they actually went out and talked to people who were in hospital, talked to families that were going out into the world when many people were being told to stay home. And so that was something that they started to do, they kept going. And they now have this very valuable archive that captures a population whose stories might not be included, because one of the things that we know from going back and looking at what happened in the Spanish flu and those stories that were documented, there were populations of people whose stories we just don't know because they weren't captured. They were not well documented. So when you think about something that you're living through, whose stories are not being told? An example of that would be around 9/11. We think about 9/11 and what happened in New York City in the perimeter around the World Trade Center. Much of what they will document is the stories of those whose lives were lost, the stories of those who were displaced, the stories of rebuilding that area. So if you've been to New York City and you've seen that area, it's now back. There's a big monument where the World Trade Center once stood, and the communities around there are bustling once again. There was a lot of displacement, a lot of displacement. And one of the stories that is particularly hard to tell are the displacement of businesses that were owned by families who were either part of the Middle Eastern North African diaspora or families who were Asian. Because they often did not use traditional banking structures, they often dealt with a cash economy. So they did not work through the small banking or the Small Business Administration. So their stories are not part of the stories that were captured historically in the first draft of history, which is often written by journalists, because journalists were not venturing into those communities. And then they were not captured in the accidental archives through government policy and government, the sort of paper trail that is created through government policy, through rebuilding, through insurance claims, through the ways that you would tell the story of a natural disaster. You might look at FEMA records, you would look at SBA records, you would look at New York City records, and you would look at county records. And there's a population of people that are not going to show up there because they work in a cash economy. So they work outside of that system. So again, archives, you have to figure out how accidental archives can help solve against blind spots that sometimes happen without us even recognizing that. We're going to go to the next slide, actually 2 slides ahead. And this is a rather strange example of an accidental archive that I rather stumbled on at one point. And it was when I was doing research for my book. My father was a returning veteran in 1946, and he returned along with a wave of servicemen who were coming back from either the European or Pacific theater of war. And like many of the veterans who returned, they were eager to get back to American life. They found that America had changed in a lot of ways. Women had marched off to work to replace the men who had disappeared. So women had entered the workforce in large numbers. There were shortages of all kinds because of the war effort. There was a shortage of clothing, there was a shortage of sugar, there was a shortage of meat. There was a shortage of wool, because at that time they used woolen material for military uniforms. And they came back with the expectation that they would be able to fully participate in American life. They were eager to vote. There's an election coming up that year. And many of the men of color, like my father, realized that America was not ready for them. So they had just participated in the fight for democracy overseas, but they were unable to participate in democracy through the voting booth here in America. And I was trying to learn as much as I could about that period of time. And I read a lot of books and I interviewed historians, and I happened upon, and again, working with the archivist in Birmingham, I happened upon a series of diaries of young girls. And it was always girls who kept diaries. And I don't know if young men kept diaries and they just weren't kept in the same way, or if it was a fad at the time. But a lot of the young women kept diaries, and the diaries were very detailed. The handwriting was beautiful. And in some cases, they were a combination of diary scrapbook. And so I'd gone through a lot of these diaries, and they were talking about interesting things. They were talking about listening to Negro music for the first time. They were talking about secret friendships. They were talking about their relationships with their maids and how they wished that they could go home with their maids because they often yearned to learn something about a community that was outside of their own. So then I went online and I thought, diaries, so interesting. So I started looking at more and more diaries, and I happened upon on this, and it's called Dot's Daily Diary. That's Dorothy. You see her on the right side, who looks almost like Judy Garland. And in this diary, what happened was, it's basically a love project that began. It started, I guess it was up and running in the mid 2000s, because I got to it in the late 2000s, but it's a labor of love from one of her relatives who realized that the calendar, if he matched her diary with the calendar in 1945, he could tell a very interesting story by basically taking the things that she talked about and then matching them to things that were happening in Inglewood, and then matching that against what was happening in the United States, and then widening the aperture and matching that with what was going on in the two theaters of war. And so it's been online, and he updates it constantly. He since has added video to it. And once he started, again, when you begin this kind of work, you realize at some point that you can't stop. You have to figure out how to keep stoking coal in the engine, because there were people who were starting to really, for nostalgic reasons, they loved this diary and they were going through it. And he realized, even though he didn't intend to do it for the rest of his life, that he had picked up a forever project. And so this is in his mother's own words. It's recollections of her younger sister. She refers to her as Sis throughout the diary, and her actual name is Louise. And he created sort of a key that would help you understand the various people that you would meet, the gentlemen who were always trying to date her and ask her out, her younger brother, who was called Sonny, and a number of other things. And so they include maps and clips and movies that Dot saw on various newsreel. And this was in Inglewood, Inglewood outside of Chicago, not Inglewood, New Jersey. Inglewood is a neighborhood outside of Chicago. So if you go to the next page, I took the dates from this week. And so you get a sense of what Dot's life was like. So a regular dull Wednesday, washed my hair after school and did most of my homework. And then you see, what's happening in the rest of the world. While she's just living her life as a high school kid, the Soviets liberated Hungary from Nazi occupation. The US forces liberated concentration camp in Germany. So it helps you understand that while war is raging, that life goes on in the United States. Red's tale of abuses, Vatican paper urges Germans to give up the fight. We move on to April 5th. After school today, Sis and I saw Hal, and he told me to meet him in Parnell at 9:45 tonight. Jim called me up today and asked if there was going to be a hayride Saturday night. That was a big deal at one point, is going on hayrides. I'm from the Midwest. I still remember hayrides. When we went by Sonny's house, and there's two Sonny. There's Sonny with a U and Sonny with an O. Sonny with a U is one of her best friends. Sonny with an O is her younger brother that you'll meet in a minute. Got in Parnell's, and Dottie sat with us. Then Hal came in, and then Margie and Betty. Betty was a very common name in the 1940s. My mother's name is Betty. Heading to see her soon. She lived in a condo at one point with 6 other women named Betty, and they all lived on 2 floors. So that was just one building in a big condo complex. So it seemed like that was you don't hear that name very much. But on that day, you can see Britain tests Victory Day floodlights. General Eisenhower tells Germans, quit factories and hide. Betty Davis is 37 years old. General Eisenhower, before he became President Eisenhower. And then on today after school, I put on my green, and I think it's green and white checkered dress is what that says. Yes, green and white check dress. Went to Parnell. Dodie, Bill, Swims, and 2 sailors were in there. Saw Hal later in the evening, and he wanted me to go on the north side with him in his uncle's car. Later on, Sis and I took Sonny to Parnell's for 3 graces. Came home kind of sleepy, so put up my hair and went to bed. So do you know what a 3 graces is? It's a banana split. And it was a treat at that time, but people were feeling guilty about going out and celebrating. So instead of ordering a banana split, which sounded indulgence, they changed the name to the 3 graces. So, and in a very Catholic city like Chicago, maybe that was a reference to the Holy Trinity, the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. Maybe it was just another way to allow people to have a good time, but but not feel like they were kicking up their heels while people in concentration camps were being liberated. And he has some notes about the young men that are swirling around her and who she likes and who she doesn't like. And then 3 Graces you see is a Parnell ice cream specialty. And I did a little bit of research to figure out why and how they changed the name. And then, you see what's happening there. So an example of, and then meat scarcity in relief for scenes when I was noting that there were meat shortages everywhere. When I was doing research around the time when my father returned from war, I realized that many of the newspapers around the country had meatless recipes, not because they were promoting veganism, but they were trying to help people figure out how to move protein in their diet when meat was in such short supply. They were trying to introduce Americans to brown bread, again, not because, for the reasons that we now reach for bread that is, with sprouted wheat or things like that, but because white flour was very hard to find. Sugar was in very short supply. But you noticed a little bit of sport scores, a new model Thunderbolt plane, and at the same time, planes destroy 11 bridges used by Burma Japs. The use of a word without blinking an eye, something that you would not use today in polite culture, most likely. You certainly wouldn't see it in print. You wouldn't hear it roll off the lips of someone who was broadcasting the news. But at that time, and for many years after, also the language that archive will capture the vernacular of a particular moment and what was acceptable and what is perhaps not acceptable. So I want to ask you what other ways people, platforms, and projects create archives, and we can go to the next slide. Examples that you can think of accidental archives in everyday life.
Well, isn't like Facebook the ultimate accidental archive?
It is, and data scraping, is happening all the time in real time to understand that, but also to figure out how to do that in an official sense. So. I am on a committee for one of the presidential libraries, for the design committee for a library that will be opening soon. And when they were looking at the potential designs in a number of architectural firms and exhibition firms, were all making their presentations. About 95% of them had some combo, some part of their presentation had actually looked at social media. And looked at the story they told, because that was suddenly part of a presidential archive, right? And that was something that probably really took flight under Barack Obama's presidency. And so now you had to figure that out. Both his official Twitter account, his official Facebook account, when they eventually had their Instagram account, but also how people reacted to various things that happened in the world. So yes, Facebook is the ultimate accidental archive. I don't
like genealogy sites too, that seems to have exploded, and it's not shared like publicly like that. But if you have that, that's maybe something that wasn't intentional over time. But
So 23andMe,
yeah,
Ancestry, Fantasy Baseball. And there's a lot of talk on Fantasy Baseball. It has nothing to do with baseball. Other examples. How do you maintain an archive like that? It's not a traditional archive in that you put it in a drawer somewhere and come up with some sort of Dewey Decimal System to monitor it. It's growing and changing, and even the things that people commented on are still in play, right?
yeah.
Because the comment section, it's truly a living archive. Who's responsible for that?
Is that where the misinformation can creep into?
So that's part of and that's one of the questions I was going to ask. We'll come to that in a minute, is what to do with the misinformation. First, who's responsible? We just stay with electronic archives for a minute that flow from social media spaces. Who's responsible for that?
It wouldn't be the owner of the account.
So you're responsible for maintaining your own archive.
Yeah,
But in the interest of, let's just use this institution. American University wants to understand student life from 1992 to 2022. Well, to do that, you kind of have to look at social media, don't you? So how do you do that, and how do you store it? How do you present it? These are real challenges that people are facing.
I guess the platforms is who owns it, is it the company, because some people can lock down their accounts if they have kind of the authority to make those decisions.
Right. And if you do it, do you include private accounts? If you're, do you only include the public facing accounts, or are you also including the private accounts? And to get to your question, Amy, because these are not monitored, either is Dot's diary, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Dot can say whatever she wants. But how do you deal with the misinformation that you know is in there? Because in Dot's diary, you don't, but right now we know that Facebook is full of mistruths, untruths, exaggerated truths, and straight out fabrications. Do you include that in the archive? And how do you notate that for the person who's going to uncover that material, who doesn't understand the era that we're living in?
Yeah, I'm just curious, like, do archives come with an explanation? And who would write that? I guess like a historian.
So that is a big debate within archival communities, because generally they are fairly hands-off. The idea is that you come to the archive and it's a neutral space, and they are not making any kind of judgments. They are not objective, and that you're able just to see facts within the archive. Again, it's the dendrochronology, it's the tree ring. We're not telling you what to think about what you see. We're just telling you what was there. But when you know at an archive, since we have Facebook as an example, when you know that it includes information that is not true, and that is information that has an impact on something as important to the body politic as our democracy, is it incumbent upon you to have a footnote of some kind? I'm not answering the question, I'm putting the question on the floor.
I would say yes. But I mean, there are things that are certainly not true, right? But then, like, for instance, the postcards, people could lie in those, but they might not believe it's a lie. I don't know, it's really tricky.
So it's a question of whether it's an accidental archive or an official archive. Do you think the rules are different in those cases? So obviously the rules for the National Archives would be a little bit different than Dot's diary. But does something like Frank Warren's work, does that have a place in some place like the National Archive or the Library of Congress?
I think so. I think it captures the part of life, even if it's, intentional in a way that other things might not be. That variety is important.
Mm-hmm.
I think accidental archives might actually be more valuable.
Pick up a little bit.
Be more valuable, because there were no guidelines in place. It was I'm interested in this thing, and then it explodes. So it seems a lot more organic, that you could kind of get more information because you're not actually expecting anything or hoping for anything. It's just something that sort of takes off beyond, I guess, beyond your control or beyond what you thought it could be.
There are also privacy issues. So if you're data scraping through something like Twitter and Facebook, if you're in a public facing, there's a question of who owns this material also. And this is something that will be debated and eventually, adjudicated in a court of law. But when you post something, there is a big question now about photos. Do you give Instagram the right to, do you lose provenance over that photo when you post your beautiful picture of your child's 5th birthday? You still own that picture. There are examples of people, and again, I actually talked to a family when I was in public radio. They were traveling in Eastern Europe and they looked up and saw themselves on a billboard. Literally, happy family in a car. Hey, they're on vacation. That is us. Wait, whoa, what? Because someone was looking for a picture of a happy family and they found the happy family and they traced it back, and because they had posted it, someone was able to take it. It wound up in a stock photo. You've heard of stock photos, right? It wound up in a stock photo file. And then it wound up in, and luckily it was something that was harmless. You know, it was like I don't remember exactly what the ad was for, but it was something that you'd want to see a happy family, but you know, it could have been something else, right? But there are questions about ownership. So if you're creating an archive, you know, can you data scrape something safely and take someone's information? So let's say it's not a social media archive. Let's say you want to understand farming in America as the globe warms. We want to understand global warming. Where do you go to find information about that?
The internet.
The internet, right? And we're in the internet.
Go to the EPA.
Okay, that's official data. You're talking about the interest in information that's very close to the ground. So where would you go to find information?
Maybe like ethnographers.
Mm-hmm. That's still pretty official. Yeah. Where would you go to find someone, if you want to understand the land? Who understands the land?
The farmer.
One more time?
The farmer.
The farmer. Any time on a farm?
Yeah.
Everything is notated. Everything is notated. Nothing, I'm sorry?
Like you could be the ethnographer
Yes.
by going to the farm.
Yes. Everything is notated. The time the crops are put in the ground, how many crops went in the ground, the rotation, the ledger of the farm animals. It is basically an almanac of the kind. So if you want to understand that, it's something that is so important. Do you have access to that information? How do you get Farmer Jed's leather brown book that has everything that he and his wife Retha have documented over decades of owning a particular patch of land? How do you get access?
You have to ask them to share it.
Build a relationship.
Because that's not online, right? Now, some of that is online because many farmers no longer use those leather books, right? They often now put everything into some sort of data spread. Farming, there's all kinds of software associated with farming. And some of that is, and then there's a question about who owns that information, because if you use the software, do you own the information? Does the company that provides the software, own the information? So it's possible to get something like that. You mentioned 23andMe, Ancestry.com. Oftentimes people have Bibles. The entire family story is inside a Bible or inside the Torah. How do you access something like that?
Have to be friends with the family or a distant relative.
Mm-hmm. And you have to ask if you can download that, because you probably can't take the Torah or the Bible or whatever it is, the document that has all of this, right? So you have to figure out how you can scan that, how that can be part of an official record in some way. Can we go to the next slide? So if I want to go back to the examples that we talked about, and let's just use Frank and Brandon, PostSecrets. And now that I'm just going to warn you, you're going to go to PostSecrets tonight, and just do it when you have a little bit of time on your hands, because it is, I mean, if you think the race car project is, if you fall into a rabbit hole there, PostSecret, it really is astonishing. what, sometimes just you feel like you open up a door in the universe or something, and at the right moment, what he has been able to collect. And similarly with Brandon, you can look at his site. He has several books, coffee table sized books that are beautiful, and just his Instagram account. And he's gotten very good at telling stories on Instagram. So now they're chained and they're like 13. You're waiting for the next one. Did they get back together? Did she make it out of the marriage? Did he take all her money? Did you get clean? Did you make it out of I mean, the stories are really. But how do archives allow us to learn important things about the human condition? Where should they live? Those are legacy projects. They will define Frank and Brandon forever. And people will be looking at their work years from now, trying to understand it. So where should that live?
Well, I'm just thinking about the moth radio.
Mhm.
Like, do you see that similarly?
I do.
But then the people are telling their own story, whereas I guess Brandon kind of tells the other person's, he's kind of a medium in a way, but in the moth, they tell it from themselves and you hear all the details.
So let's add that to the cauldron of stories. Where does Brandon and Frank's work and the moth? I think I would include narrative 4 in there. You ever heard of narrative 4? Similar to the moth, where they bring people together. Amy. Amy would tell your story to you, and then you would come up here, and after listening to Amy, you would present her story to the group, and then Amy would do the same thing. We at the Race Car Project, we dream of doing something with narrative 4 because we think it would just be like a really cool mashup to take the 6 stories and all work together. But the interesting thing is your interpretation of Amy's story says something about you.
What sticks out?
What did you hear? It's not about what she said. It's about what you heard. How did you decide to order that story? What did you see as the beginning, middle, and end? What did you decide to emphasize? What wasn't important? And similarly, your story will say something about what you heard, what you referenced. A few days ago, we were in here talking about the Underground Railroad. There was someone in here who grew up in an area where, near Underground Railroad. The story he would tell about the class is completely different because he had experience with that. But the question on the floor right now is, where do these live? Because an official archive has a home. It has caretakers. It has a mission statement and a mandate. Unofficial archives are fleeting. They are maintained as long as the caretaker walks the earth, as long as the caretaker is funded or interested in maintaining that archive. There are accidental archives that are fleeting and they completely disappear. Soldiers' letters. We talked about the Vietnam Veterans Memorial last week. There is an accidental archive that shows up every week in front of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, where people come and in front of, if you've been to the memorial, you notice that the detritus is in front of the memorial, the pictures, the things that people leave. They decided that was so important that it's someone's job every single day, someone goes and collects the teddy bears and the flowers and the letters and the snapshots and the combat boots and all the things that are left behind. And they put them in a box and they go out to a warehouse, I think it's somewhere in Suitland, Maryland, and they archive every bit of it and they tag it, and it lives there for someone to do something with it at some point. That's an accidental archive. Because it happened in front of a memorial, and because it happened on the nation's front yard, the nation's, what we consider the National Mall, the nation's front yard, someone takes care of that. But if there's no one to take care of it, if there's not an official caretaker, how do you make sure that these accidental archives that pop up and are sort of like a tear in the universe, like a matrix that allows you to look at something at a moment in time, how do you make sure that they don't disappear?
You gotta ask, is it the responsibility of some of these institutional archives to take that digital on? Because I think when you think about the
the main purpose of the National Archives is some of those, the documentation there can disintegrate, it can go away, like, you know, I mean, it's original copies. It's funny to think about anything that's digital as an original, you know, copy, because you can make millions of them. So I just wonder if those institutions have to take on a digital responsibility for some of this.
And to be able to grow and include that in some way. And
It's kind of like when I think about the local library when we were kids, and I'm dating myself, but like we'd go to the microfiche and look at like, you know, and so what's the evolution now of like online, all this is stored and how they've had to adapt to how information is archived there.
And often within challenges, you can find opportunities, right?
Right.
Because the digital nature of this, a wider audience may have access to it. Because there are some things in the archive you can only go by seeing. It's in glass, it's in temperature controlled spaces. If you want to see the original Declaration of Independence, if you want to see the piece of paper that Paul Revere had in his back pocket when he rode through the streets of Boston, if you want to see the musket that the Minutemen used or something, you can't actually touch that. But some of this you can curate and actually, put it out in the world. Are there other examples of accidental archives that you might be thinking about on the other side of this seminar in your own lives?
Would all like photo books from our grandparents be considered something like that?
Attics are full of accidental archives. An attic is an accidental archive. The kitchen drawer, and everybody has one, where you throw everything in that kitchen drawer that you don't want to think about. When you move or when you clean it, and you're like, oh, I forgot about that's an accidental archive, right? But when you start thinking with an archivist's mind, you start thinking, okay, how do I take care of this? How do I store this? Your phone is an accidental archive. I've always said that someone will come up with a business to take our old phones and capture the photos, because you take so many important photos with the phone and then you replace it. So do you know on what device does your birthday from 10 years ago live? Right, but that was a jamming birthday, right? And I don't have pictures of it anymore, So for those of us who have children, it's like, oh my goodness, which phone has the first tooth? Which phone has so your phone is an accidental archive.
I think about like our electronic calendars too, because I don't keep a diary, but like if I was gonna archive what I did in my life or what happened every day, like it's my calendar, like I live by that. And that's like a forever, I can go back and see, not forever, but like when I think about when I used to just have paper calendars, like you throw them out or you, yeah. But my electronic calendar is like literally how I remember too, what I did when, so.
The last example I want to leave you with is an accidental archive that I just discovered while doing some research from the book that I'm writing now about the race car project. And we can go to, let's go to slides 20 and 20 and 21. Let's go by 20 first. So this is the Minidoka Irrigator. It is a newspaper. Any of you have heard of Minidoka? Do you know what it is? So during, we have a number of stories in the race car project from people whose parents or grandparents were interned. Really the correct word I'm told to use is incarcerated. They really weren't interned, they were incarcerated. They were rounded up and sent to one of a dozen, they called them internment camps. You could really call them concentration camps. And that's the people who were in the camps, that's what they call them now. That is the term that they use. Because they were worried about their fidelity to the United States. They were taken mainly from West Coast communities. And they were sent to camps in Arkansas, Idaho, California, I think they may have one in Colorado, but this is from the one from Minidoka, which is a camp, a very large camp in Idaho that was filled with families that had been ripped from their communities. And they were sent to this hard scrapple stretch of Idaho that looks like Mars. It's very difficult to farm, very cold in the winter, very hot in the summer. And they lived in uninsulated barracks. And they wound up creating an incredible sense of community. And many of them were farmers. The families, in this case, often came from Stockton, California, from the nation's fruit basket, from a place where they grew, or they were successful farmers. And they figured out how to break land in Idaho and grow their own land. They created social clubs. They had an orchestra. They created their own school. So out of this really ugly situation, they created this beautiful sense of community, and they were allowed to create a newspaper. And the newspaper became an interesting document for them. It was a point of pride. So anything that happened when students graduated, when something happened, it was in the newspaper. But it is also, in every sense, an accidental archive, because it is a picture of America from people who were American, but yet not thought to be American fully in that moment. And you see the stories that they wrote. So I just wanted to leave you with that, that example. It was this is a example that came out. It was a weekly from February 27th, 1943. It was issued. It's now on microfilm at the Library of Congress. It's available in digital form, and they've been collecting these from. But this is of all the camps. This is probably the largest one. And having read several issues of this now, I'd love to do an entire class just on, how they created an entire seminar just on how they created this paper and how they got around military strictures to tell stories, because they're stories that I'm certain the military didn't expect them to tell, like malnutrition common in Japan and things like that. So once you become, you get that sort of archival bug, it lives in you. And I hope that on the other side of this, that you will be thinking of accidental archives in your own life. I hope you will put some thought into the question of where these accidental archives should live. It's something I'm thinking about myself as the director of the Race Card Project. And I hope that whatever title you have, that archivist will be added to it in some way. Thank you very much.